We're going to give everybody a couple of moments to funnel in. Great to see you all. Give everyone about a minute more. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Amy Chester, and I am the director of Rebuild by Design, and we're so excited to have this event today. Many of you know Rebuild by Design, and we are essentially an organization. We are housed at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge, and we think of ourselves as a process because we bring together global experts to work with local communities and local governments on the ground to design and implement large-scale infrastructure or policy to address climate change. And we're here today to hear from Caleb Straton because we are all experiencing increased flooding from rain events. And Rebuild by Design has been working on this since Hurricane Ida, and we have a number of different resources that are focused on New York City, but will definitely inform any of the policies in the areas that you are working as well. We, right after Hurricane Ida, brought together 20 experts who wrote essays on things that we can be doing in our communities right now. We followed that up with a more thorough report towards a rainproof New York City, which we launched with One Architecture. And then we did a cost-benefit analysis with Ramble on green infrastructure in New York City, which found a 2-to-1 payback. So if that's a 2-to-1 payback in New York City, I am sure that it could be even higher where you live. And our overall goal is to adapt with living with more water. And what we're doing right now is running 3 working groups in New York City that are both co-led by an agency partner and an NGO lead. And they are comprised of NGOs and agency partners and other stakeholders. And we're focused on 3 challenges. One is, how can we shift New York City's policies and priorities to create a comprehensive plan to prepare for increasing rainfall? The second is what an equitable buyout program could look like for New York City. And the third is about building capacities amongst communities and private sector, NGOs, so we all share the responsibility. And what's really exciting about this opportunity with the working groups is that we get to learn from other cities, and that's why we are here today. This is one of many events in our Rainproof series, so please, if you're interested, use the QR code and sign up for a conversation with Rosetta Elkin, who put out the book Landscapes of Retreat, and she's going to be joined with experts from SCAPE, landscape architecture, from Buy-in, community planning, and from the Nature Conservancy. And if you'd like to see a full list of events, you can see it here. This is our Rainproof calendar. A couple of housekeeping. Please put any of your questions in the Q&A in the provided area. We've disabled the chat so we can use it to put out information and resources that you can use. But if you have any feedback for us whatsoever, or if you want to list your event on the Rainproof calendar, please go ahead and email us at info@rebuildbydesign.org. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rafal Imam, who is our Rainproof Fellow, who's going to introduce the speakers for today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rafal, and I'm the Rainproof Fellow at Rebuild by Design. I'm going to introduce our very exciting moderator for today's event, Doug McPherson, who's an interim manager at Real Edgemere Community Land Trust. Doug is an urban planner from Queens, New York, and over the past 15 years, he's worked to expand opportunities for affordable housing, address inequities in open space access, and improve community health. Doug earned his bachelor's at the University of Pennsylvania and his master's in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We thought it'd be really exciting to bring a New York City native with someone from a different city and also someone working in community versus someone working in city for a really great conversation today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Doug to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thanks to File, and thanks to the entire Rebuild by Design team for creating the series as part of the Rainproof NYC initiative. Rebuild has been really helpful to local organizations like mine in Edgemere, who are no strangers to flooding, but are trying to navigate the questions of how we can live with more water and how we can bring more meaningful investments in blue-green infrastructure to our communities. Today's event is meant to be a conversation. Caleb is going to present a few slides, and I'll pop in here and there to ask questions. As a reminder, please feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll transition to answering questions from the audience around the halfway point in the webinar. I'm now going to transition to introducing our speaker. Caleb Straton is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Hoboken, New Jersey. He supervises implementation of the $230 million Rebuild by Design RBDHR Flood Risk Reduction Project and Hoboken's Microgrid Project. Caleb has over 10 years of experience advising urban and suburban communities on sustainability and resiliency issues. On a day-to-day basis, he coordinates the mayor's resilience priorities for energy security, transportation, emergency operations, hazard mitigation, and finance. He holds 2 nationally recognized professional certifications through the American Planning Association and the American Society of Floodplain Managers. He has an undergraduate degree in urban planning from the University at Albany and a master's in science from the Bernard and Ann Spitzer School of Architecture at the City College of New York, where he currently is an adjunct professor teaching resilience by design. Caleb lives and works in Hoboken, New Jersey with his wife, Jen. Thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Doug. I appreciate it. I ran into Doug in Hoboken yesterday, or was that 2 days ago? He was wandering around our resiliency parks, so it was great to meet him in person. And Amy and Rafal, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to speak. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with everyone. So pulling up my slides, Doug, can you give me a thumbs up? We're good. Just need to put the slideshow on. Let's see if we can get this going. Resume slideshow.
I think we're almost there. We just have to hit a full screen button.
Zoom slideshow. Close out of that. Let me stop my share and try again. Just give me 1 second.
And just a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions, put it in the chat. We are really excited about Hoboken because Hoboken was one of the original Rebuild by Design Hurricane Sandy projects. So this work stems from a collaborative process that we ran in 2013 and 2014. It's all you, Caleb.
Thank you for your patience. So I'm going to start with what Hoboken looked like 150 years ago. So the large landmass in the middle is Manhattan, built out, and the small little community on the west side is Hoboken. You can see the Palisades, but mostly like Hoboken's was wetlands. And development occurred in the floodplain and was filled in over time. And this is just a little statistic. Hoboken was the point of disembarkment for World War I. But mostly it was a working industrial waterfront. And so what does that mean? Kind of low-lying bulkheads, congestion, hazardous materials, and wasn't really built with the current climate in mind. And over time, it's morphed into really a recreational waterfront. We have great views of New York City. It's almost 100%. We just purchased the property, recreation and public use for the entire distance of our waterfront, which is about a mile and a half. So our greatest asset is also our greatest point of vulnerability. This is images from Tropical Storm Irene, 2011. And then we had Sandy in 2012. And as you can imagine, that was really a wake-up call for the community in trying to reconcile what we thought was a safe space and realizing that we had to quickly modify our thinking. So this is actually my block from Superstorm Sandy, and Grimaldi's is our favorite pizza spot. And when you have that kind of hit home, I was in grad school at the time, and I walked into the City of Hoboken. I was like, I'm studying this stuff. I'd like to work on these issues. And ultimately, I got a job at City Hall, where we started to think through and process how do you transform a community that has different flood risk profiles and begin to adapt. So some of the images I'm going to show now, you can see we've had improvement over the years in managing stormwater, so much so that we're at a point where within our combined sewer overflow system, we can manage almost 90% of rain events. So our flood pumps and systems are performing for 50 events a year, and we're getting water on our streets for one tide cycle 4 to 6 times. And so when we talk about resiliency, I'm really talking about it in the duration of impact, the extent of impact, and the frequency that it's occurring. And so Chief Resilience Officer hat, how are you bouncing back from shocks and stressors?
And if I could jump in.
Yeah, sure, Doug.
I mean, it seems like you guys are having a moment right now, right? We talk about the beautification of the waterfront and on flooding. There's a recognition of how the investments that Hoboken has made over the past few years, allowed you guys to, for example, bounce back from a significant rainfall event last September, which would have been a lot more crippling if it had happened, 10 or 15 years ago. So it seems like the mood is a mix of, like celebratory, like hopeful that, what you guys are doing is working. But if you could take me back to City Hall a decade ago, kind of in the wake of Sandy and Irene, like how was the mood different then? Like, was the attitude daunted by these challenges? Like,
It's very destabilized. Very when you're trying to wrap your arms around issues and break them down into manageable pieces. To give an example of that I'm not going to cover on the side, like we didn't have modeling 10 years ago. We didn't have modeling of coastal storm surge. We didn't have modeling of our rainfall floodplain. So when this is happening over and over and over again, the community, it becomes the biggest community issue. And then also there's a little bit of a feeling like, what do we need to do? What's our responsibility? And so I can definitely say that over time. So today I made a phone call. We have an OEM team that's working right now. I have a director that's managing communications, and we're getting ready for Saturday's rain event where we're supposed to get 2.5 inches of rain. Our systems are in place, our flood barricade program, our projects are performing, generators are working. So from 10 years ago to now, it's, inadequate systems and very limited concept of what's going to occur, where it's going to occur, to we have a pretty good measure of what's going to happen, how our systems are going to perform, and teams in place to kind of respond to what we expect to be a flood event on Saturday. To message that appropriately, we'll put out Nixle, which is just like community-wide blast, and we try to manage expectations. So there's not a perfect win. So the statistics I gave before is like 90% of rainfall flood events. And the reason why you butt up to that is there's diminishing returns to get to 100%. 100% is what? Managing 6 inches of rainfall. That's very difficult performance to hit. That's basically restoration of a natural floodplain.
I want to come
And
back to that later. But
I don't know if that's on the table for like New York or Hoboken. We borrow those principles. And I'll talk about that in the next couple slides, but it's 10 years ago was definitely tough, and now we feel better prepared. So to talk about that and why that matters in terms of our vulnerability, there's 2 breach points in the city of Hoboken for coastal storm surge, one at the north end, one at the south end. So that's how we design our seawall interventions. And then really the west side, almost all of the west side of Hoboken is vulnerable to flash flooding. So almost completely impervious surfaces, mostly built out, low-lying, pre-existing hydrology. It's a wetland, like all the worst things you could have to build on. And so what that means for us is that in dark blue, these are our rainfall flooding hotspots. So these are like the places that we know are going to flood if we get a lot of rain. More than 0.8 inches per hour tends to produce some kind of street scale flooding in Hoboken. The light blue area is the area really that we flooded during Sandy, but also that's our coastal floodplain. It's also a regulatory floodplain. So that's where we're modifying building construction. So more than 80% of the cities in that coastal floodplain. And I think that these statistics are important because the NFIP does insure $2.3 billion of property in the city of Hoboken. I think we're second or third in the state. And our residents pay premiums, $8 million a year. And that's like paying for health insurance, right? But there's a cap to that program. And so what that cap means is that we have a delta of about $8 to $10 billion of flood risk that's not covered by the National Flood Insurance Program. And so what does that mean? That means that we have a lot of room to develop interventions to reduce that risk, and also defray future premium increases for insurance. I got to see Amy talk last week, and like these are real concerns for people that have policies and premium increases. The risk rating 2.0 that's rolling out is substantial, so 16% increase through 2025 for our residents. So we want to defray insurance costs. We want to defray actual flood risk. And we were fortunate enough to work with Rebuild by Design back in the day. This is like maybe 2014, 2013, we got started. And what we did, it was a federal program at the time, and there was a big pot of money that was put out there. And Rebuild organized teams, led the design conversations. We worked with Royal Haskell DHV and the Office of Metropolitan Architecture to develop a 4-part integrated water management strategy. And we borrowed from the Dutch, and we took advice from international experts, which is, again, Rebuild's bread and butter. And the 4-part water management strategy for us is, number 1, keep storm surge out of the community. That's the resist element. And then using their 3 strategies: delay, store, discharge, but there's actually a ever expanding list of strategies that we're using. Discharge is active pumping during rain events. Delay is keeping as much water out of the combined sewer system as possible. And store is developing underground detention basins that we can control and that create more capacity within our sewer system. So Rebuild helped us take, that this is longer than 10 years ago, but take that uncertainty, break it down into strategies, and then put it into actionable pieces that the city could undertake, that the state government could undertake, where we could get federal support. And that was the initial $230 million award for really the resist element of the project. That project is now $392 million. So good ideas beget additional financing. So that funding is coming through additional state and federal money. And then the city undertook delay, store, discharge, which is rainfall flood risk. And addressing rainfall flood risk, we're in about $150 million, and we have more that's going on. I just want to, if I slow down too much, Doug, speed me up, but I'm going to get into the exciting things quickly here. I just think it's important to talk about kind of where we came from and where we are now, because you go from the concepts into like, where does this go on paper? And so again, the dark blue area here, north and south end, the reason why these lines are kind of askew and not directly on the waterfront, there's a public feedback process we went through. If you build on the waterfront, it's taller. It keeps people away from the waterfront and engagement. And really what we heard was like, don't take away our views, don't disconnect us from the waterfront, don't build in our neighborhood, don't build in front of my property, don't build behind my property, but don't leave me out. And so there's a bunch of different constituencies that ended up going through the concept development process. So we have an inland flood protection measure that reduces flood risk for, like, again, 90% of the community for coastal storm surge. And all the green areas on this map are where our interventions are for green infrastructure, meaning delay and store strategies, as well as our discharge strategies, which is pumping. To go one step further, putting that into an environmental review process, the areas that are seaward of the levee system, we have separate storm sewers. So you're taking area out of the CSO, which reduces flood risk. That's the light gray and red dotted lines that are closer on the north waterfront and again on the south waterfront. The dark blue line is the seawalls that we're constructing. They're not going to look like seawalls. And the reason why they go from east to west on the south and from south to north on the north side is that you can see these kind of lines of topography. Stevens Point is a high point in the city of Hoboken. It's 100 feet above sea level. What we're trying to do, and then on the backside, reaching the Palisades, what we're trying to do is reach those high points. So 15 feet above sea level, create a continuous line of protection. And the reason why the delay store discharge infrastructure is so important in what we're building, which is the blue and gray hash lines, so separating storm sewers, building underground retention and pumps. So this is Resilient City Park, the Housing Authority redevelopment site, Block 10 expansion. We are actively managing now an internal drainage system to a coastal levee. So the reason why Hoboken's a little bit further ahead in its rainfall strategy is that there was flood risk that preceded Sandy, like we saw the 6 inches of rain from Irene. It's a quality of life issue for the community. And so we developed this distributed strategy that we could design, build, operate, maintain on our own in parallel to that big pot of federal funding.
Could I ask something? And I think this slide's actually really helpful because it gives you a pretty good overview of the urban fabric of Hoboken. And I grew up in a low density neighborhood, mostly single 2-family houses in Queens, New York. And walking through Hoboken earlier this week, one of the things that hits you first is that it's so dense. Like there isn't a ton of unutilized or underutilized land. There are, beautiful open spaces, and I know, you're going to talk about those in a minute, but how have your resiliency efforts incorporated practices that involve private property owners? You've talked to us a little bit about what the public sector is doing, but how have you leveraged the private sector to, further the rainproofing strategy?
So that's a great question. So there's kind of, I would say, 3 layers. The first is that on the roofs, we're doing all new projects have green roofs, and we incentivize that through developing roof decks, which are not permitted within our zoning ordinance. The second is doing, for substantial retrofits or for new construction, we're doing on-site detention for every single property so that your downspouts not going into the CSO, it's going into a cistern that's below your slab that ultimately is released after the storm event. And then the third piece is really through site development or redevelopment. And I think in New York, it's called something different. It might be like planned development district, or it's basically spot zoning, where you have a developer that wants to build something that's inconsistent with the existing land use, or it's outside of the existing what's permitted in terms of bulk or area. So we say, okay, build higher, build more units, but also build us a $30 million park, or also build us a linear greenway or meet or exceed the pre-development standards and manage more stormwater than is just on your site. And I'll go through, there's two examples of it in this slide. The first is at 7th and Jackson. I don't know why we name our parks by their geographic location. And then the second one is at 800 Monroe. It's right next door. Another brilliant name. I guess we have a naming committee, but no one can decide what they actually want to name parks. And so I'll get into that. And just for part of the reason why we're doing a lot of this through park development and green infrastructure is because through Rebuild by Design, we're extremely sensitive to the fact that the predominantly infrastructure is gray. It doesn't perform blue sky benefits, doesn't add to the urban fabric. And in some cases, it can even be alienating for the community. From the onset of this project, we set out and we said, we are not going to build single utility pieces of infrastructure. And we are not going to accept something that detracts from the existing urban fabric. You're going to ask a question.
Could I just ask a quick follow-up before you go on?
Sure.
So you mentioned that, there are these requirements that are placed upon, private entities that are undertaking new construction in the city. And they're then giving stewardship over assets, and they can be maybe as simple as green infrastructure and open space, or as complicated as, underground detention, or a combination of the two. But how do they give you got the city, like the relevant agencies, comfort that the infrastructure is going to do what we hope it's going to do, and like what are their obligations to steward it for the entire design life, or kind of a shorter period of time within that?
So the bigger the system, the more assurance we have. So a lot of the time we do partnerships with our sewage authority, and they're the ones that sets the standard. They also control the weir outlet. A lot of the times we use an OptiSensor, which is basically a remote control outflow where they can actually see how much is in the tank when the tank's releasing. They can choose when they want to send water back into the CSO. And a lot of those will either had deed restrictions, or there's a shared service agreement with North Hudson so they can come in and clean or maintain, or compel the owner to clean or maintain them. As far as the performance of the green roofs, I think that's a little bit more, we put that on the HOA and building itself. We haven't had an instance where those systems have failed. We've been doing it for about 12 years now. And I think that there's a certain amount of pride of ownership, like if you are fortunate enough to have outdoor space in an urban area, like best keep it performing well. And a lot of it, mostly it's the planting medium is so hardy, using succulents and other, I wouldn't say like it's definitely designed by either a landscape architect or an architect. So some of it's the honor system, but if it's a really heavily engineered and managed practice, it's also something that we usually have a deed restriction or a shared service. I just want to touch quickly on Rebuild by Design, the elements that we're doing on the waterfront. We're going to build parks, and this is a concept that incorporates an 11-foot high seawall underneath a active area on the west side and a passive area on the east side, with a walking path that kind of traverses the high point in elevation. And the concept for this project was maintain access to the waterfront, because that's important, but we're also going to use gates. As the project, as far as scale goes, this is about almost 2 city blocks in size. And this is part of that state partnership for the coastal flood risk reduction. And, that's what's underneath that is heavy foundation construction with foundations, stem walls. But what it ends up looking like as that starts to wind its way through the city is something that we've used in aesthetic treatment. So color, material, landscaping. The colors that we chose are from, it's the state flag of New Jersey, but it's also Dutch. It's also safety orange. It's something that contributes, we think, to the urban aesthetic. Communities fighting about what that actual color ends up being. Everyone wants to do blue, like a dark blue, and have it blend in. And there's still kind of tension on what the aesthetic of that's going to be over the long term. This is across from a school, just to give you an idea of when we're building infrastructure, we're trying to make it look like it's supposed to be at the site that it's at. This is the area that's just coming out of that park on the south side, winding through like a heavy commercial residential area. So the images that we were just looking at, that's kind of like the manifestation of the purple lines on this map. And then everything on the backside of the city of Hoboken, really rainfall related, is what I think that this group's interested in. And it's how we manage our infrastructure that's interior to this coastal levee area. So we went from the concept map, high level concept, to actually block by block, lot by lot, and putting the acquisition of parcels on the west side of the city. Every area that you see in yellow on the west side are parcels that we've either acquired, developed, or in the process of acquiring for this water management strategy. In citing the pumps, we did those in the right of way. So this is the first pump station that we constructed, which is H5. This is part of our discharge strategy. This is what's going on below ground, which is connecting into our CSO. And that's how we actively manage rainfall when it exceeds the capacity of our park systems. The second pump that we built, this is H1. This was designed by a local architect, John Stasi. This is a 50 million gallon per day pump. And the reason why there's this large external housing is because we have backup generators for that, because our H1 sewer shed is in the lowest lying area of the city. We want to make sure it stays online. Our H1 sewer shed also is part of where the Housing Authority redevelopment area is. And we are actually dewatered the city from Superstorm Sandy with this pump station. Getting into the delay and store projects, the first one we did was a demonstration project at City Hall. So taking all the downspouts from City Hall, connecting them into cisterns. The cisterns are then used for rain gardens. We did porous concrete there. We built a green roof, but put it on the ground. The idea was, what is the lowest cost, highest impact investment we can make? And so for like less than $500,000, we took an entire city block out of our combined sewer overflow, while also being able to demonstrate proof of concept for what does green infrastructure look like, how is it managed. And this was what ultimately got us into the development of Southwest Resiliency Park. So this was a 1 acre site that we acquired. It was a surface parking lot. Went through design concept, mostly passive uses. There's a dog park here, and but the purpose of that project was to make sure that in Southwest Hoboken there's park space within a 5-minute walk, but it had to manage stormwater. It had to do it very, very well. So heavily engineered up surface, permeable pavers, rain gardens below ground. You have a stormwater management system that ultimately can be released to the combined sewer overflow. And what that looks like today is just it's an urban park, and the landscaping has been really well established at this point. And what we've seen is that people are using the park. It has that, we use this term again, blue sky performance, but it's functioning and helping us reduce flooding on the streets during those heavy precipitation events. This is a redevelopment project that we talked about a little bit before, where the large building, kind of like at the top of my screen here, we increased density on this site by, I think, 4 or 5 stories. And so what that meant was, by increasing the density, we were able to build 2 separate park spaces, each have 200,000 gallons of storage underneath. So Southwest Park has 200,000 gallons of storage subsurface. This is 400,000 gallons of storage subsurface. Olympic swimming pool is like 500,000 gallons. And so these 2 park projects, you're creating a plaza and open space for a redevelopment area. And on the south side, we have a community center and an open lawn and a playground that's activated when it's not raining out. And this is a really large project for us, and it really helped prove the concept of, you can create spaces in an urban environment that also reflect needs of the community. And this is what that project looks like today. Well, not today. This picture is much nicer today. Doug, you were there. It's kind of a little dried out in the winter, but this is what it looks like in the summer. Our next project that we did a little bit further north in the city was Resilient City Park. And so the concept for this is we were trying to buy the most acreage in a sewer shed that we knew had a lot of flooding. It was a large acquisition, so the city used our Open Space Trust Fund to do a $30 million acquisition, and the project itself was about $50 million. So on the surface, again, you see active and passive spaces, the use of green infrastructure, but what's really going on below the project is where we spent the majority of our money. So deep pile foundations. The pink is a 1 million gallon tank that's connected to the H6 pump station, which we're constructed. It's our third pump station. This project is exciting because it is also part of a storm sewer separation that separates sewers in a 40-acre watershed in the city. The treatment train of the surface rain gardens and also MS4 compliant like separators. You're getting stormwater treated water into that basin, connected to a pump station that then goes to a new force main and outfall that is discharging clean water to the Hudson River. This is construction images of the pump station that's being built on the north side. This is what that underground cistern looks like in construction. So sheet piling down to bedrock. This little guy right here is doing some kind of epoxy treatment on one of the joints. But heavily engineered practice. This is the tank itself it's about the size of a city block. And what that means is in one city block, 1 million gallon detention tank with a force main, we can manage a 40-acre watershed. So this type of practice is really important for water quality, that's how we're able to partner with North Hudson. So and it's something I kind of want to emphasize because I think it's an important point, but we do not have the same goals. So water quality control is different than water quantity control. I'm building basically like a FEMA project. I'm looking at rainfall, flood risk mitigation. We had funding through FEMA for this project, $10 million to build this tank. North Hudson, our sewage authority partner, was competitive in getting funding from FEMA for their pump station, but it also impacts the EPA clean water requirements. And what that looks like today is, again, this just surface park, blue sky performance treatment. The soccer field actually has a ton of storage underneath it, just large aggregate HDP piping laid out. So you've got a high void space underneath a active field. So the actual outside of that tank, we have like another 1 million gallons of storage and all these various features, like a basketball court. So this is a basketball court, plays like a basketball court, looks like a basketball court, but it's sunk below grade. It's another Dutch thing. I actually don't remember where we saw this, but it's been done before, and it's a feature that just instead of water pooling at our intersections or being pushed towards properties, it's draining into the park, draining into the basketball basin, and this basketball basin is immediately adjacent to stormwater features. So I have to give a shout out to our transportation department. They've been a huge partner in doing curb extension bump outs, rain garden bump outs. In this picture, you have daylighting with bollards, a raised intersection with an epoxy treatment to distinguish the crossing areas for people walking to the park. You have thermoplastic markings going to ADA, curb extensions and bump outs, a bike lane, and we have found ways to leverage other projects into our park projects and really our entire right-of-way strategy through the Vision Zero campaign. So Hoboken hasn't had a traffic-related fatality in 7 years. And so I see that as a huge win for our quality of life and our residents and just the basic safety of it, but to integrate it with our resiliency efforts, what we're getting is now you have a wider pool to pull funding from. So every time I see a transportation project, I see a resiliency project because I can either expand the curb edge, put in planters, put in tree pits, put in rain gardens. It's part of this. I think Amy said it before. It's like every drop counts strategy. We want to just keep creating more pervious surfaces as part of our projects. Go ahead.
So thanks for running through the open space projects. And I think each of the three that you just walked us through is open today, but they weren't all completed at the same time. So I
Right.
think Southwest may have been the first. So curious about, for you, like what lessons did you learn from your first iteration that you then like carried into 7th and Jackson, that you carried into Northwest, and that, you might be thinking about as you're implementing the housing authority redevelopment, which, could also include a future resiliency park?
Sure. I just want to point out before I forget it, this is the H6 pump station. So the Great Lawn, you've got that big tank underneath, and then right next to it, directly north of the pavilion area, you have the H6 pump station, which is our third pump station. So to answer your question, what have we learned is that the combination of below ground storage and active pumping is the most effective measure. The pumps have been really important because they can address volume. But if you're pumping CSO, you're not addressing EPA issues, water quality issues. You're not actually making a positive improvement on the environment. So the two other projects I'm going to talk about, which are one's we got our bid tab back and we're going to go into construction this spring. And then the next one's in design. And I'm going to get a little bit into more like how putting those colors of money together, you can make these projects work. Definitely have a vision and then back into that with a professional team. So every one of these projects that I've described takes a really big team to put together. And our construction management team is for this project with Michael Baker International, and we're actually going to be using them on the next job. And so like if you're we had different construction managers, or we had in-house construction management, and we have a great engineering division, but for something where you're spending money and there's contractors and subcontractors and a schedule, like we've just seen a lot of success with projects hiring and spending. Michael Baker's contract was multiple 7 figures for this project, but it's worthwhile having that expertise on site because I don't really know what I'm looking at. Like I build parks, but that's not like the actual physical construction is not exactly my strength. And so, being aware of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then building teams around that, I think is really important, both in-house and out of house. So every one of our projects, we're working in-house with half a dozen people, a dozen people. Out of house, same thing, half a dozen people, a dozen people. That's consistent through our projects. So Star White House design, the Southwest Resiliency Park, they're also designing Block 10, so like carry over institutional knowledge. The 7th and Jackson project was done by Langen, who's an engineer. Langen is a sub to Star White House on the other projects. Resiliency Park was done by Olin, who is out of Philly, and they have an incredible track record with stormwater management. And I learned something yesterday. So on this site, we did the site's lead site certification, and we used a like Philly product, a aggregate, like a sand mix, which was recycled bottle glass. I got to actually like hold the recycled materials in my hand. I didn't know that before this, but so Olin has this incredible pedigree, and then ENLP was actually a smaller engineering firm, but this was a hazardous site that we had to remediate. So they had an incredible licensed site remediation professional, strong familiarity through putting together all the environmental documentation for the project acquisition. And ENLP actually just got bought by AKRF, which is like a pretty well-established firm in this region. And so we use that team for this. We've used Scape for waterfront projects. Scape actually did the concept design for this as part of Rebuild by Design. We used Datner architecture for the concept development of Maritime Park, and AECOM is designing for DEP for not only a project I'm going to discuss later, which is 800 Monroe, but Harborside Park, which we reviewed before. So it's just like spreading it around, making big teams, and having those things ground truth in I would say a really serious benefit cost analysis, hydraulic models, and then also having the environmental assessment. We had paused on that slide a long time ago. Having an environmental impact statement for a comprehensive strategy means that I can fold all of these projects, all of these concepts into something that's already basically permitted at the federal level. So when you're going and you're looking for these federal buckets of money, like we got $10 million from the BRIC program to build the detention basin that's in this park. Like when we did the environmental review for that, they were just like, cool. Like they were like, it fits, it works. So that's, as far as lessons learned go on this, it's kind of, you have to do the pre-work of two-dimensional hydraulic modeling, benefit cost analysis, having a comprehensive plan, doing the environmental review. Because when we did Southwest Park, we kind of just were like, this is what we think is good. We know we need to capture rainfall. With 7th and Jackson, with Northwest Resiliency Park, with 800 Monroe, with the expansion, we've been much more deliberate in both incorporating pumping and then also doing storm sewer separation adjacent to parks so you can pull and expand that watershed that's flowing to these areas. So I'm just going to keep going because I think it'll be interesting to look at the slides as I kind of describe that process. I already touched a little bit on how we are incorporating green infrastructure into road projects. That's not exciting. The storm sewer separation so it's heavy work that goes on in the streets. You're kind of reshaping watersheds, adding compliant treatment. So this big giant hole in the ground is where you're dealing with like floatables and contaminants that enter stormwater just from being on roads. Ultimately, when it's discharged to the Hudson, you're getting something that is not harmful to the environment. I think this slide's funny because the little blue squiggle that I drew over here, that's our council person for the second ward. So she was like an on-site construction manager for us. I get texts from her every day being like, they're screwing this up. But the reason why I bring that up is because we have really strong buy-in from our elected officials, and the distribution of our projects touches every ward in Hoboken. We're really, really, really small, really dense. And by doing that, I've seen resolutions, ordinances, codes and standards, all of our projects, including bonding, is usually a 9-0 vote for these projects when we go and we ask to spend money, award contracts. And it's a positive that gets reinforced. Like we see it in campaign materials. We see it in getting acknowledgement up and down the ladder from state and federal officials. So every time we can, we try to pull people into our projects and give them ownership and to be proud of the work that we're doing. This is an example of we've done more than 1 million square feet of green roofs by changing our ordinances. So you can see in some of the newer developments, you've got green roofs. This large area is a parking deck. So the utility of that is in conflict with our rainfall development goals. So we didn't achieve that on that project. But the point here is that, separating rooftop leaders is a huge, huge benefit because we're keeping water out of the storm sewer system at the exact time when we don't want to overwhelm our CSO. I want to talk a little bit about how we're handling maintenance. So if it's an engineer practice, we're typically hiring a contractor who has a landscape architect on staff to maintain it. So this is an example of like how it was being managed before and how after with a contractor and replanting. And we've seen great success with North Hudson Sewage Authority. If there's a technical component to cleaning a trash can, or this actually great that they've flipped up as part of most of our in-street green infrastructure is green gray. We actually have like curbside cisterns to just create that big capacity that we need, and then surface green infrastructure. So it's like a little micro park, but in these green gray tanks, we get like 10,000 gallons of stormwater management. So over the 60 that we're building, that's 6 million gallons, and it's maybe my math's off, 600,000 gallons. The point is that every every time we can capture a gallon of water, we're trying to do that. We have volunteer training we do like a spring fling, get the community out to come and weed. We have a youth training program that really is kind of like trash maintenance or like preventative maintenance. And then again, we hire contractors when necessary. We also have our Parks, Recreation, and Public Property team, who's, I would hold them up against anyone. I can't say enough good things about their work. If it's a less sophisticated practice, we have them out there doing some landscaping, some basic maintenance. I know maintenance is a topic that's usually comes up, and it's an area of concern. I'd say over the last 10 years, we've kind of learned quite a bit. And at the end of the day, it's you have to maintain the practices that you build. I want to shift gears to talk about two projects that we have coming online. This is an overview slide, and I apologize that it's a little grainy. I really wanted to get a better image, but this just shows like the relative locations of those projects I was discussing. So Southwest Resiliency Park, 7th and Jackson, Harborside Park we saw in the beginning, which is the coastal flood protection measure, and then Northwest Resiliency Park. 800 Monroe is kind of on that same west side. This will be done as part of a redevelopment agreement. So again, it's a developer-funded project. And when I was preparing these slides, I thought that these were interesting because it lets you dive in. You've seen kind of our strategy at a macro level, resist, delay, store, discharge. But at a micro level, this is what we're going through. What are the existing conditions? It's a cap site, it has contamination. What are our priorities? Delay, store, discharge. How do we realize that? What's the strategic programming? And then through the public engagement process, and this is again, template from Rebuild by Design, go into the community and walking through those different design drivers. And what happens is you go through a bit of an iterative process. There's buildings in this area. So like the difference between active and passive, that's kind of like the leading edge of the project. Ultimately, what you end up with is again, this kind of surface treatment. And in this project specifically, we're using a lot of trellises because of the establishment period for new plantings for trees. Although there's a ton of trees on this site, there's a lot of surface green infrastructure. There's also subsurface infrastructure, and then separated sewers around the project, and transportation assets that are adjacent because there's a light rail station adjacent to the project. I say Google 800 Monroe. So like I'd sent Amy, you dug a couple of links. We build story maps for all these projects. So anything that I'm talking about now is probably linked to a story map online. And that goes through the design documents, like what was the process and just generally how does engagement occur around developing these concepts. Go ahead.
Oh, I think you just answered the question. I was really just curious about, the tools that you guys use to tease out preferences for, active versus passive open space. And like, since these projects take so much time, how are you
Sure.
keeping people up to date on what's going to happen in their neighborhood and when is it going to happen?
Yeah. So one of the tools that we've used is we develop like pop-up parks. And if we acquire a site, we'll typically program it immediately. Something that's like quick and dirty, less than $250,000, and meant to immediately activate the space. So we already start that engagement process by like people that are using it. We'll go out there, we'll have design meetings on site. What is it like? What do you like about this? What don't you like about this? We're actually doing that at, so this is the existing Southwest Park. We purchased the property adjacent to it. We're expanding it. So we're going to double the size of that park area. And this is one section of the city that's, floods a lot. It's also a section of the city that's underserved in terms of housing and park space. And so what we're doing with that site is we're basically making a Southwest Park 2.0. This is that pop-up park I was just describing. It's just pickleball courts, like paint it, throw some nets up. Pickleball folks are absolutely great. I don't want to say anything derogatory, but they're very passionate. And so built a bunch of pickleball courts. They're constantly filled. And, but that's not the purpose of the acquisition. And so the purpose of acquiring the site, it's kind of a constrained site. So I'm going to dive into this a little bit because I thought it was an interesting case study. We've got an utility easement on one whole half of the site. You can see the distribution of the surface rain gardens. It's kind of like we can't fit underground detention on every square inch of this. So we are focused in where we're putting detention, in how water is moving on the site. And ultimately, we're doing a sewer separation adjacent to the site as well. So this is just a rendering of kind of like, how does the storm impact the site? Where are the areas where water is getting collected? How does it go into the detention basin? And we're doing a pump, actually, because the grade here is like 4 feet above sea level. And to create the detention under the park, that outfall point is actually lower than our combined sewer. So we're putting a pump in place, going to be pumping back into the combined sewer system, but we're linking back into that system somewhere closer to our H1 pump system. So you're getting this like rainfall treatment back into the CSO. It's not perfect, but I would say that this is definitely an improvement in our design development process over the first Southwest Park. And at the end of the day, you get programmed open space. The expansion of Southwest Park, I think, is interesting to discuss because the I-Bank is State of New Jersey's state revolving loan fund. So that's EPA funds that get pushed into really like a no interest, low interest, partial debt forgiveness package. So if you look at these different funding sources, municipal open space trust fund, so that's outside of the budget, that's not a municipal bond, that's not debt service. The I-Bank with principal forgiveness. We have a Green Acres program, which is a state-funded program, the Urban Park program, another state-funded program, and then we received $6 million from FEMA because the project fit within the environmental impact statement. We did a benefit cost analysis. We expanded the actual watershed around the project to direct more water to this site, so we can realize a better benefit. And this is just an example of a funding profile. We got bids back somewhere in the neighborhood of $9 million to build this project. And we're going to get $6 million from BRIC, and that's going to fund a portion of the park and a portion of the pumping station. And the cost estimate for the pumping station isn't part of this because it's going to be part of another shared service agreement and partnership that we do with our sewage authority. So I'd put the site in there, but I think it's less important, but it's just showing the costs and the benefits in different categories of, how do we get a BCA that works that's more than one? I know Amy talked, it's always 2 to 1. In this case, because we had a pre-existing park next to this site, so even though there's residual flood risk, our BCA was reduced because of the impacts of that prior project. So that's why this number looks a little lower. These are just real costs. This is how we submitted to FEMA. So it's a little bit, there are other benefits to this project that aren't necessarily part of that calculation. But when you see the big benefit is the park project. So the estimate that we had to put into the cost of the project is actually, you'll see it's much higher because our bids came back so competitively. So we're seeing a little bit of, I don't know if it's whether the contractor has done prior projects. Our engineers are still reviewing the bid tab, but we're looking to award a contract that's $7 million less than our design estimate for the project, which is really unusual for us and kind of the first time that we've seen it. I think that we're going to have additional costs. We didn't bid the drainage improvements in the roadway. So I think that might be where some of that delta is, where the actual physical construction of the park might be 9 million, but then we're doing the pump and the drainage improvements. So that's going to add additional project costs, which get us up to this $17 million number. So I wish I was more in the weeds on this project, but that's just my understanding of how we get to that benefit cost analysis. The last thing I want to talk about.
Before we before we move on, I mean, I know you say that slide isn't super important, but I mean, I find it super interesting, and like a big part of your job, seemingly, and the city's job, is to pitch proposals for flood mitigation infrastructures to funding agencies at the state or the
Right.
federal level, like FEMA, and you've clearly been really successful at that. And right now, at least for the U.S. based audience, we're currently in this once in a generation moment where Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, Justice 40 initiative are making unprecedented climate and environmental justice resources available for communities who've been shut out of those resources. So kind of pulling from the Hoboken experience, how do you think these communities can advocate for our projects,
Yeah.
with those federal agencies? Like, how do we lay out the value proposition in a way that's going to be compelling for things like resiliency parks or other cloud-burst infrastructure?
I think that it's just fundamental to begin with the end in mind. And so it's not necessary to do a benefit cost analysis, but it sure makes it easier to have that conversation if you're going to approach getting into these larger pools of federal funding. And I'm not, we got exposure to the benefit cost analysis through the rebuild by design process. And so we make it a standard part of every one of our projects that we're always trying to achieve that BCA of at least one. And the best way to do that is to start with a comprehensive approach. And I will say that it's, I'm just going to go to this one slide so I can talk about this. So having a comprehensive approach was the only option for Hoboken because we can't just like elevate every building. Like our police stations and fire stations are in the floodplain. So developing a comprehensive approach meant that we had synergies between different projects. We had taken a systems thinking approach and leveraging what exists and what we need to build. And if you're undertaking these type of projects, it's important to get a really firm understanding of your sewer sheds, a really firm understanding of your watersheds, and an alignment of priorities. There's different means of intervention that are, I would say, non-physical. So like policy, I didn't talk a lot about buildings resilience design guidelines and the 2.0 that we issued after Ida, or the policies that we have a higher design flood elevation and all those other things. But I would say aligning projects so that they're part of a network, and not trying to necessarily solve upstream or downstream issues, but trying to address things holistically. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but in our case, that's what has worked, is taking a comprehensive approach. I'm not suggesting that there aren't outstanding projects that address very site-specific issues. But the purpose of Rebuild by Design was to enable a community to transform from high risk, high vulnerability to low risk, low vulnerability. And doing that through these 4 strategies. And it was important, you and I are having this conversation. This group is having this conversation today because of where we were 10 or 12 years ago with those storm events. And I think maybe last week we were saying, like, you never let a good emergency go to waste, but the grief that the community goes through and the process of reconciling what we thought was the status quo versus, what's changing, increase in precipitation events, changing storm patterns. Like, we don't really talk about climate change per se as we engage on these individual projects, but it is such a known and accepted standard that, sea level rise is increasing. We are tracking precipitation events. So that's what this slide is. It's since we did the second pump station, every single one of these bars is an event where we had street level flooding. But what's important here is that we have both volume. So how much did it rain? So this huge event over here is Hurricane Ida, 6.5 inch rain event, peak rainfall intensity of 4 inches per hour. Like, we flooded. and it was difficult. But we bounced back really quickly. Ida, it took us 2 or 3 days to recover. Henri was like 24 hours, and Ophelia was one tide cycle. So the systems are performing the way that we designed them to. The systems are providing benefits during all these different conditions. They're supported by the community. It gives my operating team that's going to be out in the field on Saturday assurances of this is roughly what we're going to see. And I can't stress the partnership that we have with our sewage authority, which is governed by a different board of directors, has its own executive director. They have their own engineer. They have their own goals that are related to water quality and long-term control plans. And every single chance we get to overlap and work together, we try to do it, because my flood risk reduction goals also help CSO reduction goals. And it expands the pool of funding that we have to the EPA or to FEMA when we work together. And so the last slide that I want to go over, which I think is kind of unique, is capitalizing establishment costs. So the state revolving loan fund, which is New Jersey's iBank, has basically said, we will pay for 2 years of site maintenance for trees, plantings, stormwater, whatever you're building, for that establishment period. And so what this is actually a bid item for Northwest Park. So for the next 2 years, our contractor that bid and built that project is responsible for maintaining every practice on that site while those practices establish themselves. And I want to distinguish that from maintenance, in that the establishment cost is an authorized cost. Maintenance is something that we're going to have to do in the park, and something that we're going to have to take on in future years. And we think that it's going to be about $150,000 to $200,000 a year to maintain that site, because each one of those features is performed. But I think that it's something just good to put out there. If you're building something, definitely throw those first 2 years of establishment into your debt service package, so that you can not be tasked with that right off the bat, and basically have someone give you the keys and walk away. I would make that akin to, like, if you're building a sewage treatment plant, like they do a commissioning period. And it's because these are engineer practices, we're basically saying we have a 2-year commissioning period for the projects that we're building. So I'll end there. I wanted to just say, Doug, it was great to meet you. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Paul and Amy, thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone who hung on. It looks like we have 90 folks on the call still. So this is super close to me, and I just appreciate everyone's time. So thank you very much.
Really appreciate you sharing, Caleb. I want to move to some of the audience questions. We had a few good ones come in.
Right.
Joanna asks, what are the groundwater conditions in Hoboken, and how did they impact final design choices?
Horrible. Like the worst subsurface conditions. So on the west side of the city, our depth to groundwater is like 4 feet, 3 feet, and it's also tidally affected water table. And then, so that really limits how much we can site. So for 7th and Jackson, Southwest Park, those are those high void space HDPE piping. You're basically creating like a watertight detention basin. And I'm just going to go back, and in Northwest Park, when we built that big cistern, the reason why there's sheet piling all around this is we did depth of bedrock sheet piling, dewatering, like external and internal well points, dewatered that water table, and built this about 25 feet below grade. And the actual detention tank is watertight. So there's no infiltration into the tank from that Great Lawn area. And so it is, the water table is definitely a real constraint and a challenging constraint, which is also why we're moving to that like tank plus pumping at the Southwest Park expansion, because then you have greater head for gravity. And I just want to quickly go back to that environmental slide, which I think is interesting. So the entire north end area that's draining, it's called BSF property because it's before we built the site when this map is from, but that entire watershed is a gravity storm sewer that's flowing to this site, which is also why we had to build, sheet piling down to bedrock, dewater, a watertight tank, so that you could gravity flow the rainfall that's going to be going from that neighborhood to that site. So that's a great question.
We got another question here. Some of these infrastructure investments are very expensive, and like, how do you assess like the community's reaction to these investments? Like, do people feel like the money was well spent? Like, has there been scrutiny of that? Just what's the conversation been?
That another great question. So our open space trust fund, which we did a lot of the acquisition and we do a lot of the debt service for these projects from, was done by referendum. So that's literally people going, voting. They're like, yes, we want an open space trust. We actually increased that tax. That was again done by referendum. I think that we had more than like 75% of people that were like, yes, we want to be taxed more for open space. So I would say at the individual level, it's very positive. If you go to the neighborhood level, it's very positive because you're creating a neighborhood asset. You're addressing open space and flood risk. If you remember, 80% of Hoboken's in the floodplain, so no one really wants to live in a neighborhood that floods all the time. It's tough to get to work because the streets are flooding. So by bundling these things together, I would say that we have very strong public support for the interventions and the development community supporting that through what they're building on site and off site. But there is definitely a threshold. I don't see an infinite amount of funding for community-based funding for flood risk infrastructure, which is why I lean so heavily into that, do the environmental review, do the benefit cost analysis, try to capture money from others. And I would say as like a general profile, we're trying to match one Hoboken dollar with one state or federal dollar. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all state or federal taxes anyways, but to try and pull that back in, I think is really helpful. So we've tried really hard to be cognizant of both the capital expenses and the operating expenses associated with these projects. But I think that broadly, me and our staff have been giving a tremendous amount of agency on behalf of the community and basically saying like, you really need to not do nothing. And so much so you need to like leave no stone unturned, like beg, borrow, steal, and get this done, get it done quickly, get as much done as you can. Because I think that there's an awareness and we've seen it. I mean, really this last fall, there was a bunch of rain events that were severe. And, we really had some 6 to 12 inch street level flooding for one tide cycle. And, the areas that flood were putting barricade systems in and catch basin sensors and shutting down roads. So like literally we know it's going to flood. We're going to shut these roads down proactively. Like don't go outside during this time period. And it becomes a disruption rather than like a catastrophe. Or we've seen prior storm
events. And we had one question here from Blair, since you have part of your job is thinking about flooding, part of it's thinking about energy. Like, were there any passive energy source solutions considered as part of any of the pumping facilities that you guys have cited? So I guess the idea is using solar power or other renewables to make the pumping work.
So that's a great question. The energy transition is occurring. So I'll give you an example. Like we're building a new DPW facility and it's going to be like completely electrified, electric vehicles, garbage trucks. Snowplows we haven't really figured out yet. That's going to have cogeneration, solar. The way that FEMA looks at these practices, so like the pump stations, they're considered critical infrastructure. And there's a disconnect between what the federal government considers appropriate backup energy. So you have a primary energy source. So I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but we did a consolidation and elevation we took 3 substations and made them into 2. They're both elevated 15 feet above grade, so outside of our design flood elevation. One of them is really actually very, very cool. It's right next to Northwest Park. It's designed again by local architect John Stasi, and it looks like a lantern that glows in the dark. And so our primary energy is comes from PSE&G, which is our electrical service provider. We have our, I would say, offsite distributed resources. The microgrid was a concept of trying to develop conduit and assets, dispatchable assets, which is primarily natural gas generators, so that we could power our critical facilities. The city purchases 100% renewable energy as part of our baseline operations. So it's tough to do solar projects in a mostly built out community that has limited flat roof space, sometimes competing interests with our green roof program. So we did do a pilot program for community solar that just came online. So somewhere in New Jersey, I don't know where, there's enough power for that. Our housing authority is as part of the community solar project, and they actually see reduction in their electrical bills because of that offsite solar use. So that's where I consider one place that we've been a little innovative and ahead of the curve. But because of the critical nature of these facilities, we don't have solar assets connected to them. But I think that it's something that we want to continue to explore as an opportunity, and that, like, it definitely hasn't been ruled out. It's just that, not only do these things have to be on, we have to have backup power for the pumping stations, because that's how things go pretty sideways when you don't have backup power. That's a great question.
I'm seeing another question here that's really actually very relevant to some of the work that I'm doing in engineer in Queens, related to storm sewers and backflow. And are there any like mechanisms that have been installed for your storm sewer outfalls to prevent backflow into that system in a way that might reduce the capacity during heavy rainfall events combined with
Yeah, that's so we have duck bills on all of the CSO outfalls. And the interesting thing about our pump stations is that, and the reason why like most of our rain events are governed by that tide cycle, is that all of our outfalls are below high tide. So at high tide, you have increased head, which is reduced pumping capacity. At low tide, you have decreased head, which is increased pumping capacity. So we have backflow prevention as part of our CSO, but we also have backflow prevention and even in some cases ejector pumps in private properties, so that the head coming out of a building can push into the sewer system. And I'll drop a link, but after Hurricane Ida, it was such a severe event that like every person was like, what do we do about our drainage systems? So this is not related to the Sewage Authority projects or their pumping stations, but we did a resilient building design guidelines 2.0. So the first one that we published was reconciling FEMA standards, state standards, and local National Flood Insurance Program standards. The second one we did was, how do I address flood risk reduction on my property? So that's all the different practices that basically keep water out of a building, whether it's coming from on the street, or if it's coming from the roof leaders, or it's actually coming from your backyard into basement, or whatever it is. We really developed those strategies for people that implement on their own. But backflow prevention is absolutely something that works and something that's necessary, and we've seen it installed on all new construction projects, all substantial rehabilitation projects. And if people are still having sewage backup issues, we recommend getting a design engineer and putting them in place, because they're very, very good.
So we talked about funding sources for a few things. We had one question about maintenance. Like how is the city funding and managing maintenance of the rain gardens? Is there like one answer to that, or is it a combination of things?
So I would say that there's so we have shared services with North Hudson. So they're doing the technical work. If there's something below grade, or if there's a trash screen, they do it as part of like their catch basin clean out. If there's something that's less technical, we have youth training, volunteer work, contractors, city staff. And then there's one thing I left out, but that on our main commercial street, which is Washington Street, it's about a mile. The Business Alliance actually pays for the maintenance of those practices for beautification, but also like New York City audience. People went sideways about how many rats are on the street, and like we get constant complaints about it. So we actually have like pest management that overlays with the rain gardens, because people are like, the rain gardens are the reason why we have an overpopulation of rats. And I was like, I don't think that's the case. We don't have enough rain gardens to have as many rats as we have. And what it actually came down to is like there was just, burrowing material, and when you treat it, like you kill the rats and they don't come back. Or if we did a containerization program because like we didn't have standards for how people put garbage out, so rats were like, this is delicious, we're gonna eat all of this. But to get back to the question, we take a everything approach, and to varying degrees you can expect kind of what things look like based on the level of training, whether it's volunteer, whether it's paid, or whether it's in-house professional staff. But we have maintenance contracts. Some of them are on call, and some of them are site specific, and some of them are project specific. So for like Zane City Park, for example, we'll probably do a unique maintenance contract just for that project. If you zoom way back out, part of the reason why we have to maintain the practices is because the delay store discharge elements of our water management program are directly related to the functioning of our coastal levee. So we're building seawalls and levees to keep storm surge out. All the delay store discharge elements have to function, they have to be measurable, and it has to be a practice that is performing to our kind of design goals so that we can certify, and this is super important, so that we can certify to FEMA the performance of the system. And what that generates is called a conditional letter of map revision. Within that conditional letter of map revision, it means that we're taking out properties from the National Flood Insurance Program. So literally, we're going to see a premium reduction for the people that are paying into the National Flood Insurance Program. And what we think that we're going to be able to do is through that premium reduction, actually generate funds to maintain the system that we're building. So instead of someone paying for insurance, they're going to get a reduction in the insurance bill, and they're going to be able to transfer a portion of that to actually maintain a system that's protecting their assets in the community from these different kind of flood risk profiles.
We got one local question. The New York area is kind of going through this major New York, New Jersey harbor and tributaries focus area feasibility study, the HATS kind of study.
Yep.
for short.
Yeah.
How will Hoboken be affected by that? And does what's planned for that study and kind of whatever phase it's in right now affect how you guys are thinking through your resilience strategy?
So it's an interesting question. I actually was up at West Point talking about this, and I don't think that I was like overtly critical, but the idea of pushing down like a top down, this is what's going to work for the region, I think is going to be practically like really challenging to implement. And the reason why I say that is because anytime you're doing site acquisition, so like literally down to the block and lot level, I'm talking about like protracted, difficult negotiations that are occurring between legal counsel, individuals, the city. There's money involved. There's flood risk impacts that are involved. And I think that it's important work to be done. The HAT study, I don't think it's going to directly impact Hoboken because we have a strategy in place. It was incorporated into their basis of design for that study. Region wide, I think that it's a really important thought tool in terms of engagement of, if there's funding involved and this is the strategy the Army Corps is going to develop, how are local communities being engaged? I actually think that Amy might have insight on this. I know that Rebuild was vocally critical of the bait and switch that occurred, where there was a concept developed in one New York City administration, and then a different concept kind of implemented that wasn't really vetted through a community engagement process. So I think that the HAT study is going to be really important, and it's it's important. It's an important discussion to have about how is adaptation going to become manifest in this region, at what scale and at what location. So, as far as whatever Hoboken's doing is going to integrate with whatever ultimately gets built as part of that project. But I don't think that project's going to supersede the work that we've done, because we're already either in construction or completed and like have funding available for majority of our projects. So another just great question.
Well, I really appreciate all the great questions that we've gotten from the audience. Thank you guys all for being here. And just a reminder to follow Rebuild at rebuildbydesign.org for more resources, including forthcoming recommendations from the Rainproof NYC panels and the working groups. As a reminder, next month on April 18th, Rebuild will be hosting the next official Rainproof NYC event, which will be a discussion with Professor Rosetta Elkin from the Pratt Institute and several other experts. The discussion will cover field studies from around the world, and that suggests how communities are more likely to adapt to change when the landscape is appreciated. So you're not going to want to miss that. But many thanks to Caleb for offering us some incredible insights today. I've learned a lot, and we really appreciate you being here with us. Any closing words, Amy?
Just a virtual standing ovation for both you and Caleb. Thank you, Doug and Caleb, for taking out your time today and for visiting Hoboken. And if anybody has any questions or possible suggestions for events, just email us and we'd love to talk to you.
Thank
Have
you
a great
again for
rest of the day.
Thank you again for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch soon. Doug, it was great to meet you.
Likewise. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Take care, everyone.